For many years, Hungary fought only to defend, holding ground, enduring pressure. In 1595, that changed. After decades under Ottoman control, Hungary chose to attack, and the first target was Esztergom. At that time, the Ottomans still maintained a strong garrison and artillery, but their main armies were campaigning elsewhere. Then a rapid offensive was planned. Infantry and heavy cavalry were deployed. The objective was clear: to retake Esztergom. The fortress was strong but isolated. Hungary seized the moment. The siege unfolded through pressure, not surprised. Cannons roared. Walls cracked. Day by day, the fortress weakened. After weeks of fighting, a stronghold held for decades was broken. The banners changed. Esztergom returned to Hungarian hands, and with it the belief that the Ottomans could continue to expand into Central Europe came to an end. By 1595, the war in Hungary was no longer new to anyone involved. For decades, the Ottoman Empire and the Habsburg monarchy had fought for control of the same land. Battles had come and gone. Fortresses had changed hands, but the war itself had never truly ended. One reason was a single stubborn city, Esztergom. Esztergom stood on high ground above the Danube River. The river was a lifeline, used for trade, transport, and military movement. Whoever controlled Esztergom could watch that lifeline, influence it, and, when necessary, cut it. That is why Esztergom became especially important. When the Ottomans captured Esztergom in the mid-6th century, they did not merely take a city. They gained a strategic foothold from Esztergom. The Ottomans could monitor the river, protect their own supply routes, and maintain constant pressure on central Hungary without sending large armies deep into enemy territory. The mere existence of the fortress kept the entire region in a state of permanent instability. For many years, Hungary was forced to accept this reality. The strategy was based on defense. Rivers served as natural barriers. Border fortresses were meant to buy time. Distance was used to slow the enemy's advance. As long as Ottoman positions north of the frontier were not fully secure, the system could still function. But by the early 1590s, it was no longer sufficient. The frontier was no longer a clearly defined line. It had become a zone of constant pressure, and the Danube, instead of protecting Hungary, had begun to serve the Ottoman Empire. At the same time, inside Esztergom, the Ottomans were not standing still. The commanders of the fortress fully understood the value of its position. They knew that if Esztergom were threatened, the entire system of control along the Danube would be shaken. The walls were inspected again. Older sections were reinforced with earth and timber. Artillery positions were adjusted to cover the river in all likely approaches. Grain stores were checked. Gunpowder was measured. Water sources inside the city were placed under strict protection. The garrison trained more frequently. There was no panic, but there was clear vigilance. Stretch remained strong. Yet these preparations reflected something else as well. The Ottomans understood that the fortress was no longer protected by absolute security, because the wider course of the war was changing. The Ottoman Empire was forced to divide its forces. Multiple fronts were active at the same time. Its main armies were marching in other directions. Esztergom was still formidable, but it was more isolated than ever. For Hungary and the Habsburg side, this raised a new question. The issue was no longer how to defend better north of the Danube. It was whether an Ottoman fortress positioned directly on this river should be allowed to continue to exist at all. Esztergom became the focal point. Attacking it was not about territorial expansion. It was about removing a strategic stronghold that left all of Hungary vulnerable. This decision marked a fundamental shift. Hungary would no longer merely react, no longer only defend. For the first time in many years, the war would be pushed forward across the Danube, and from that moment on, every preparation was directed toward Esztergom. Wars do not begin when the first shot is fired. They begin when people stop pretending nothing will happen. By the late spring of 1595, that moment had arrived. For the Ottomans inside Esztergom, preparation shifted in tone. This was no longer simple caution. It was readiness. The fortress commander changed his posture. From defensive maintenance to active expectation. Signals were established between towers. Messenger routes were tested. Every officer was reminded of his role if the city came under siege. The garrison drilled more frequently. Cannons were not only positioned, they were sighted, calibrated, and rehearsed. Ammunition was distributed closer to firing points to reduce delay once combat began. Even daily life inside the city adjusted. Non-essential movement was restricted. Civilians were directed towards safer inner areas. Food was rationed with the assumption that resupply might never come. Esztergom was no longer simply standing guard. It was bracing. Across the frontier, something equally important was happening for the first time. The Habsburg monarchy stopped observing and started acting. Reports from scouts and observers were no longer filed and forgotten. They were discussed, compared, confirmed. The conclusion became unavoidable. The Ottomans were preparing for a siege, which meant the fortress could be taken if the Habsburgs moved decisively. Vienna hesitation ended. Orders were issued quietly but firmly. This was not a raid. This was not a show of force. It was a full-scale siege operation. Troops were summoned from across imperial territory. German infantry formed the core of the army, disciplined, numerous, and trained for prolonged campaigns. Hungarian units were attached for their knowledge of terrain, roads, and river crossings. Italian engineers and artillery specialists were contracted to handle siege guns and fortifications. This army did not gather in one dramatic moment. It assembled gradually. Columns formed in different regions. They moved along separate routes to avoid attracting early attention. Supplies followed behind, slow, heavy, and essential. Cannons were hauled over rough roads. Wagons creaked under the weight of powder and shot. Horses were spared where possible because everyone understood the same thing. The siege is not won by speed. It is won by endurance. As the army moved eastward, the tone among the soldiers shifted. This was not a border skirmish they would fight and leave behind. They were marching toward a fortress that had stood for decades, and they were expected to stay until the outcome was decided. By early summer, the advance could no longer be hidden. Ottoman scouts reported movement, large formations, artillery trains, supply columns. There was no doubt now the enemy was coming. Inside Esztergom, the final phase of preparation began. Defensive plans were reviewed one last time. Fallback positions were designated. Signals for fire, retreat, and reinforcement were clarified. The soldiers understood what this meant. Inside the walls, the damage was clear. Sections of the fortifications lay broken. Houses near the outer defenses were shattered or dismantled. Smoke still lingered in places where fires had burned during the fighting. Civilians emerged slowly from cellars and shelters. They did not cheer. They looked around, trying to understand what had changed and what had not. For the Ottoman garrison, the end came with mixed emotions. They were allowed to leave the city under terms of surrender. Weapons were laid down. Wounded soldiers were treated as well as circumstances allowed. There was no sense of shame among them. They had not been surprised. They had not collapsed in panic. They had held as long as holding was possible. From the Habsburg perspective, the victory was measured, not triumphant. Esztergom had not fallen in a single dramatic moment. It had been taken through pressure, patience, and endurance. Engineers moved quickly to inspect the walls. Repairs began almost immediately, even before the smoke fully cleared. The city was too important to leave vulnerable. Churches were reclaimed. Administrative control was re-established. Garrisons were assigned to hold the fortress against any attempt to retake it. Beyond the city, the wider war reacted. News of Esztergom's fall traveled fast along the Danube and across Central Europe. For the Habsburg monarchy, it was proof that the war could move in their favor. For the Ottoman Empire, it was a warning not of defeat but of resistance. The Ottomans had lost an important stronghold, but they had not lost their ability to fight. And everyone involved understood one thing clearly. The capture of Esztergom did not end the war, changed its direction. The frontier shifted, confidence shifted with it, and both sides began preparing for what would come next, because in wars like this, the end of one siege is never the end of the story. It is only the space between chapters. Long after the fighting ended, Esztergom continued to matter, not because of how the city fell but because of what its fall changed. The capture of Esztergom in 1595 did not end the war, changed how both sides understood it. For the Habsburg monarchy, the siege proved something essential. Ottoman strongholds were not permanent. With preparation, patience, and coordination, they could be taken back. Confidence shifted. So did ambition. For the Ottoman Empire, the loss delivered a warning. The empire was still strong but not untouchable. Distance divided attention, and long supply lines carried real consequences. Strategy adjusted. Caution increased. For Hungary, Esztergom marked a break in a long pattern. After more than 50 years, a key Ottoman fortress had been removed. Life did not become easier, but it became different. The siege also left a broader lesson. Early modern wars were not decided by single moments of heroism. They were decided by time, logistics, and pressure. That is why Esztergom is remembered not as the end of a war but as the moment belief change. And in long wars, belief often matters more than victory.